Well, Chay Bowes knows everything that's happening on the European scene and actually far beyond it. But I want to focus his mind right now in the beer hall antics of the Munich Peace and Security Forum, where there was not much peace to be found and no prospect of security. At least that's how it looked to me. Let's see how Chay Bowes, master of the political arts, saw it. Chay, welcome back, legend. Great to be in the same city as you, albeit we only briefly. Tell me, did you view the Munich Security Conference with the horror that I did?
Yeah, there's almost too many sort of paradoxes and almost comedic similarities with what's happening now in Germany. You could paraphrase it all with are we really looking at third time lucky, as you alluded to? I mean, it's quite remarkable. Whereas the Munich Security Conference used to be a place where dissenting voices could occasionally debate each other. Take Vladimir Putin's landmark speech there in 2007, I think it was, George, where he really prophetically laid out the reality of what was going to happen on the European continent and further if US hegemony and this aggressive machine wasn't checked in some way, if multipolarity wasn't seen as a natural progression to a more just world. Many, many things. I mean, people should, our viewers should check it out, his speech in 2007. Interestingly, during that speech, some of these neocon idols people, will be very, very familiar with, sat in the crowd. John McCain laughing at President Putin as he pointed out the reality of what was going to happen in Europe, and much of it has come to pass. Unchecked NATO expansion, the aggressive positioning of the European Union as a sort of an authoritarian, unipolar power in the region. And we've heard all of this stuff confirmed. We've heard Kaya Kallas, this exquisitely stupid woman, in the gaps between her making an absolute fool of herself and embarrassing herself and Europe in the process, actually saying some things. And one of the things she said was that she believes Europe is a superpower. Now, it's a superpower that would run out of fuel within 3 months, according to one of the senior officials in Rheinmetall, one of Germany's biggest arms manufacturers. It's a country that would last a month at war, according to the British defense chief. It's a country that, it's an entity that would be completely dismantled and dismembered very rapidly if it was foolish enough to push for this almost inevitable desired conflict with Russia, which we've seen at the conference. And I think what's most important and most worrying has been how any sort of angle of debate has been completely dispelled and pushed out to the margins. It became basically a fundraising roadshow for this really increasingly authoritarian dictatorship in Ukraine. More and more people dragged from the streets, more and more dying, more and more corruption. We had a very senior energy official pulled from a train. I'm told he was in disguise trying to escape Ukraine. A friend of Mr. Mindich, who ended up in Israel walking on a beach after stealing $100 million from the Ukrainian people. We've people living in tents inside their apartments in Kiev. We've groups of people on the streets of Odessa in active combat against the recruiters who are trying to abduct increasing numbers of men for the front. Despite all of this pseudo-religious devotion to this golden cow, Mr. Zelensky, this incredibly corrupt ex-actor, who again took to the stage, acted appropriately, did as he was told, spewed out his Russophobic bile. We had the Danish leader, this remarkable call for long-range strikes into Russia. All the Russians understand, these subhumans, these Untermenschen, all they understand is violence. You have to crush them. Let's bomb Moscow. Let's send them more weapons. Lindsey Graham giving, his usual bloodthirsty sort of recount of is there a war the man has ever seen that he didn't like or didn't think was magnificent. So it was a remarkable sort of a demonstration of the lack of insight, the lack of an ability to climb down the ladder that they've climbed up as their war in Ukraine fails. It seems the only remedy and method of forward motion among the European elites is escalation, George. And it's very scary. And in reality, we see there was more finesse in the 1930s in Nazi Germany about relations with the British, the Czechs, the Poles, and the Russians. More finesse. There was more meetings between the Nazi government with their neighbors and with other European powers than there's been in the last 4 years between the European Union and Russia. They completely rule out contacts with Russia. The only person, interestingly, who didn't mention Ukraine in his address to the conference was Marco Rubio.
I'll come to him in a minute, but your analysis there, which closely mirrors my own, there has been not a trace of that analysis anywhere in the Western media, and believe me, I've searched for it. It's like it was a frenzy, if I was being particularly cruel, like a Munich beer hall gathering in the early days of the Austrian painter. It was a frenzy of hate mirrored by supporting claque of Western journalists, not one of whom raised any of the points that you have just made and that I tried to make in my monologue. It's like they're marching us off to war, Chay.
Well, remember, the media machine in the UK particularly, and remember the UK, as you know, is essentially the central dynamo in this Russophobic war. I think there's some leeway in France, potentially with, historic ties to Russia, the Swiss talking about it, Macron talking about the Spanish. Maybe we should talk to the Russians. Maybe this isn't such a good idea. It's London that is this absolutely religiously devout force for war. Absolutely. We saw Mr. Healy, this really repugnant character, proudly proclaiming days ago that 500,000, £500 million, 500 million pounds sterling was going to be allocated to Ukraine. Anybody who lives in the UK, many friends and colleagues and family members of mine do, who look out their window, are completely dismayed at how anybody could proclaim such a misallocation of British taxpayers' money at a time when the UK is arguably facing its greatest challenges intrinsically in hundreds of years. The actual collapse of the Union due to the ineptitude of the London Parliament we're looking at. The Welsh idea of secession is gathering steam. Northern Ireland, Scotland. The Union is looking at an almost inevitable collapse now politically. Radical voices are now seizing the initiative everywhere in the UK. And what is the British establishment doing? It's, number one, kicking the doors down of senior, sort of the Prince of Darkness, as he was known, as you will know, Mr. Mandelson, this exceptionally, influential man. We're beginning to learn about how this cabal has governed for itself, exclusively for itself and for themselves. We're beginning to understand that. How people like Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who controlled the British media with an iron fist for so many decades. Nobody mentions that man's name. Nobody mentions the fact that he was a Mossad kingpin. Nobody mentions the fact of his relations to Mandelson. This is all part of a greater plan to dupe the British taxpayer, to control the media, which is absolutely enthusiastically compliant with their MI5 and MI6 handlers, the BBC, Channel 4 running a long form program this week about our soldiers facing Putin. It's quite remarkable to see the amount of money and effort that's been putting into distracting the British people from the chronic social issues on the streets of the UK with this idea that there's some sort of a Lord of the Rings struggle going on against the evil Russians. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever, yet the money is still sent. The corruption is ignored. And the idea that the political idea, I believe, and the political decision has been made in London and in Brussels that the only way to regain plausibility about the Ukraine conflict is to push this conflict to the point where there is some kind of reckoning between Russia and NATO militarily. It seems increasingly likely to me, and I've been very much a person who's tried to de-escalate that discussion from here in Russia, because it's not something the Russians want to do. The Russians didn't want this war at all in the first place. But as I look at the situation now, it seems to me that we're dealing with a political elite in Europe, which is, number one, exquisitely corrupt, number two, exquisitely foolish and uneducated about Russia and the whole Eastern continent, the whole global South. They don't want to engage in that. We heard Rubio, as you say, excusing colonialism. Let's forget about, Operation Condor in South America. Let's forget about the 60,000 people that died on that continent, Bolivia. Forget about Pinochet. It's quite remarkable. We really are now experiencing a post-truth reality when it comes to Europe. And as the American rug has been pulled away from the Europeans, this massive umbrella of economic and military power, which they could refer everything to essentially for decision making. Now the Americans have basically said, we are now going to reverse back to the Monroe era 200 years ago. We're going to start imposing our will in our neighborhood. You're going to have to start imposing it here. Something that's very interesting I heard today, the Polish leader suggesting that Poland will now try to attain its own nuclear weapons. It's quite remarkable. The Germans, as you say, determined to create the biggest army on the continent of Europe, bigger than the Turkish army, which is now the second biggest in NATO, which is, of course, ideologically and politically very much detached from the EU, because they've been left in the queue for the EU for nearly 30 years, while Ukraine, we're being told, is going to join next year. It's a remarkable sort of ludicrous attempt to denude the process, which demands so much detail and so much examination of any sort of plausible reality. It's absolutely insane. And what the most dangerous part of it is, I believe, is that the European elites, alongside the bankers and the profiteers in the burgeoning weapons industry in the United States and Europe, they have nothing to lose from a conflict, nothing to lose whatsoever. It won't be them who will perish in a conflict. They won't lose their large pensions and jobs, and they will be the people who will hope that the scale of destruction or the next escalation will be so devastating that their absolute complicity and guilt in creating this scaffold that this conflict could burn on will be forgotten, because the Russians, believe me, if there is a conflict, it won't be fought with one hand tied behind their back. It's impossible to suggest that. And a lot of this stuff has been long predicted by people like yourself and by people like myself, who said that there is an end game here. But the end game means that the devastation would be so bad from a war on the European continent, which wouldn't necessarily be a nuclear war, that it would very quickly become irrelevant and academic how we got to where we are. If cities in Europe are burning again, if people are dying in their hundreds of thousands, it's quite remarkable that we're even having this conversation tonight, George. It really is really quite shocking.
Indeed it is. I knew that Rubio's comments about decolonization would have caught your attention because, of course, your country landed the first blow against the British Empire and successfully threw it off, for which they've never really truthfully forgiven you. But what about if Rubio's statements, which got them all up on their feet cheering, were smoke and mirrors to cover essentially a retreat by the United States from the European continent and from the Ukraine war. As you rightly said, he's the only one who didn't mention Ukraine in his speech. The rest of them couldn't keep the word out of their mouths. And when he said, we're not leaving you, we don't want you to be our vassals, we want you to be our partners, and you'll need to look after, I'm paraphrasing now, but you'll need to look after your neighborhood because we are retreating to look after ours. What about if it was just a kind of Valentine's Day Dear John letter that he was reading?
Yeah, well, look, listening to your question, the first thing that sprung to mind was the chaotic withdrawal from Vietnam. Something, I was a very young child at that time. You'll remember it being a man of more senior years, let's say. The older the violin, the sweeter the tune, George. You'll remember that. Those scenes of the chaotic withdrawal from the roof of the embassy. Mirrored again in Afghanistan with those horrendous scenes of human beings dropping from these vast aircraft as they took off from the airport. Traumatic stuff. History repeats. The one thing that unites those things, and something I predicted in 2022 when this phase of the conflict began in Ukraine, was that the United States will abandon Ukraine. People can go back on my Twitter and look at it. I said they will abandon Ukraine as they abandoned Vietnam, Afghanistan, as they essentially abandoned the people they were funding in the Middle East for their proxy wars of choice, covert and overt. This is what this empire has done. It sucked in conflict, chewed it to its liking, spat it out or swallowed it, depending on its political masters at the time. Look at Venezuela today. I don't believe for a minute that the United States has any interest in the European continent anymore, other than a fiscal one, a financial one. Interestingly, tonight there's a LNG tanker stuck in the Baltic Sea, trying to bring LNG from America, which cost twice as much, by the way, as the LNG that would have come through a pipeline from Russia, which they blew up. It's stuck there. A German icebreaker went to release this giant tanker. It got stuck, broke down, and is also trapped in the ice. The only single vessel on Earth that can release both of these vessels is a Russian nuclear icebreaker, but the Germans have sanctioned the people who are capable of doing it. This is the level of idiocy we're at. The Americans now, in my view, have reverted to an almost 1950s style American dream ideology under the Trump administration. We saw the top lawyer in the US basically tells us to stop talking about the Epstein files because the Dow Jones index is up. Let's stop talking about what's happened on the Epstein Island because the Dow is up. The stock market's up. You should be more grateful for being able to live the American dream. So I think the Americans are very serious under Trump about and potentially under his successor, if somebody like J.D. Vance was to win the next election. Unlikely when you look at a midterm, but in the long term, you just don't know. I think they are very serious about repairing financial relationships with Russia. I think people like Kirill Dmitriev, Steve Witkoff are in those roles purely because there is a real reason to repair those relationships, attempting to maybe pull Russia away from the embrace of China. There's a bigger chessboard than Ukraine. But I think for sure there's another reality that you have to remember. Tonight, there are nearly 120,000 troops in Europe of American origin, dozens of bases, attack helicopters, nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. I don't see the Americans withdrawing those troops, no more than they'll withdraw them from Japan or from the Philippines or from their vast network of military bases. I think there's 800 military bases around the world by the Americans. I think they're going to keep that influence, but I think they're definitely now politically at odds with the liberal elites in Europe, the Green Party, as you call them, the tree-hugging elites. They're at odds with that, but they're not at odds with the fact that they have now succeeded to a great extent in keeping the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in, which was the rationale for the entire Marshall Plan. It all makes sense now when you look back at how America rebuilt Germany in its own image in many respects. And now, after the Nord Stream being destroyed and that arterial supply of clean, cheap Russian energy being cut by mysterious forces, 4 Ukrainians in their underwear with some sandwiches from Tesco and, a bottle of vodka decided to slide down a rope to the bottom of the sea. I mean, it's ludicrous, insanity. But now that it's happened, America holds its foot on the neck of Europe economically, and they're not going to let that go. And the more they detach themselves politically from Europe, the more chaos there will be inside Europe, and the more that dependence will grow.
It's funny you mentioned Tesco. It's just been revealed today that 50%, half of Tesco's employees are in receipt of universal credit, public benefits, because their living standards are so low, their wages are so poor, even though Tesco's profits are simultaneously up to £3 billion in the last year. But finally, Chay, you rightly lampooned the garden gnome. For that, I've, of course, stood next to him many a time. I mean, he makes Rishi Sunak look tall. The garden gnome, the dwarf, John Healey, the great war leader of Great Britain. You rightly lampooned him. But what can I say about the Irish Prime Minister, who's the Prime Minister of a neutral country, a non-NATO country, who's just threatened to board Russian ships? With whose army is he going to do that?
Well, George, we're in a serious business and a grim business at times like this. And we've been here before. So it always helps to end on with a bit of humor. And this is a laughing matter, I would have to say to you. Ireland has a vast flotilla, an armada of 2 seagoing vessels, 2. It has a cadre of 700 men in its navy, half of which are not in any role that would go on a ship. They would probably get sick if they went on the dodgems. So Ireland is eagerly throwing itself on the mat outside the door of the Brussels Parliament, hoping to get some brownie points by suggesting that they would board a Russian ship. It's beyond laughable. But the core reality is also very important. This is a deployed tactic to try and show we're on board. Now, the legality of it even would be dubious. As you say, the Republic of Ireland is a neutral country. It cannot be in any alliance with any military power, particularly not with NATO. And I think the Irish people have made that very, very clear that they don't want any part in NATO. But the other reality is that Ireland is also bound by a clause, I think clause 45 in the European Charter as a member for mutual defence. That also exists. And Catastrophe Callas mentioned that as well in one of her rare sentient moments in Munich, suggesting that under that charter, we're all obliged to go to war and die for each other. It reminds me of this, very poignant sort of cartoon where the European leaders are all in a room and say, hands up who wants to start a war with Russia in Ukraine, and they all put their hands up. Then hands up who wants to go and fight it, and all the hands stay down. The reality is that very few of the leaders who dine, and I've been in this place, I've been in the European Parliament and seen how these people dine in one of their 3 or 4, like 4 and 5 star restaurants with their free parking and their carpeted hallways. This is a place of influence, but it's a place of influence not by the politicians on policy and on the people. It's a place of influence on them. They are influenced by big business, big banking, and how to denude sovereignty and democracy in Europe. Ask the Romanians from where I was deported. Ask the people in Moldova, ask the Georgians, and of course ask the ordinary Ukrainian on the street, the Ukrainians who are now energetically fighting Zelensky's kidnappers tooth and nail on the street to defend their fellow countrymen. It's a heartwarming and heart-rending demonstration of citizens defending citizens, and we hope to see much more of that. The big question, George, is in Ireland, where we've mobilized so much energy and anger and so much productivity and such a voice for Palestine, when are we going to muster that same voice for Ireland? When are the British people going to muster that same voice for themselves, for the NHS, for increasing policing, for increasing healthcare for children, the suicide epidemic, the drugs epidemic, the ghettoization of whole communities in cities, to the great glee of radical powers in our islands? This is the reality that we have to face. Will it take an armed conflict on a scale that only our grandparents could ever even recall or think would ever be seen? Is that what it's going to take for us to get out on the streets and remove these horrendous, beastly creatures who are haunting the Epstein Island and the halls of power, and then telling us it's all an imaginary fantasy made up by the Russians? Is a war what it's going to take? It's a really, really scary time, George.
It is, on this day, you've just reminded me, on this day in 2003, I and my friends led 2 million people through the streets of London to try to forestall the invasion of Iraq. We turned the whole country upside down for many months in the run-up to the war, and indeed after it. But in Britain today, and I suspect in Ireland also, the streets are empty. They're at least empty on the questions we've been discussing tonight. The questions of sovereignty, the questions of the independence of our countries, and the questions of unending funding and arming of a conflict in Ukraine that could very well lead to an all-out European war. The streets are empty, Chay. Why?
Yeah, it's something that dismays me, and it particularly dismays me with the left. Traditionally, the peace movements would have come from people on the left. I mean, the CND movement, the anti-war movement, which you led, which I recall with great fondness, the massive deployment of ordinary people from across the political divide in many ways as well. It was a very unifying thing. To stop the illegal war in Iraq, which, remember, killed much more than 1 million people. A lie, all dead for a lie. A region, a great civilization destroyed, shattered and smashed and thrown to the four winds, much like Ukraine now. This terrible human cost, which, of course, appreciates into the ordinary population, never affects the elites, the Lindsey Grahams, the Ursula von der Leyens, these advocates for conflict and war. They're never affected by it. So it's a terrible, terrible tragedy. I think, this is my personal view, as somebody who would have identified themselves as a left-leaning socialist in my younger years, very much so. And my father was a shop steward in the Dublin Gas Company, a firebrand man. My family would have been on the left of politics. The older I get, the more I see that the left has been hollowed out by this liberal, ultra-liberal wokeism, which I think has taken the fire in the bellies of the left. The idea that we will get out on the streets, we will agitate, and we will work for peace in the interests of the working people, the taxpayer. I think it's been hollowed out to an extent by the idea that your son can be a boy on a Monday, a girl on a Tuesday. It seems to have denuded the left and the capability to organize for peace and to shout down more radical voices on the right, who now, it seems to me, are the only ones politically who are arguing against the escalation of war in Europe. It's quite remarkable. Alice Weidel, Viktor Orban, these are the people talking about ending this conflict, stopping the funding of this endless war. And on the left, you've got people like Robert Fico who are agreeing with them. So there is hope of a unified movement. But you can count on one hand the political voices of reason right now in Europe. It's very similar to 1930s Europe, where any kind of accommodation of the rising threat of the great blonde witch, as the Russians called the Nazis, that rolled into Belarus and Russia, massacring people as they went. The people who spoke against it were so marginalized. It reminds me of the people now who are speaking against this militarization in Europe. People like yourself, like myself in a smaller capacity, and others who, again, you can probably name on one hand, George, people from our islands who are openly fighting and working to tell the people of those islands what's really happening and what the elites who will profit from a war are doing to ensure that war occurs, to distract from their gross serial political incompetence at home.